everyone. So today we're going to do a mini workshop before our writing session, and we're going to talk about realistic goal setting for academic writers. I think that a lot of us don't have a very systematic approach to goal setting. So what I'm hoping is that this will help you enter into each writing session with at least a very concrete way of going about setting goals, even if you don't have a concrete goal in mind when you start. And then perhaps you can have a more systematic way of setting yourself up on a daily basis to make sure that your writing is as productive as possible. So goal setting is a big part of productivity, and a humane and realistic approach to goal setting can be a source of motivation and positive energy for academic writers. Unfortunately, we often use a negative approach and frame our writing goals in terms of looming deadlines and our work patterns in terms of completing an entire project. So you'll hear people say things like, okay, I need to finish the literature review in 3 weeks, but I don't even know where to start. Or maybe I don't have time to focus on writing this week, but luckily it isn't due for a month. I have a paper proposal due in mid-January, so I'll work on it over the winter break. Or maybe I planned on writing 5 pages per day, but something else always got in the way. Where did the time go? Now my deadline is almost here. So you can see in these examples that you have the planning stages and you have the end stages of the writing process, but they neglect the middle, the actual mechanical process of writing sentence after sentence, day by day. Now, this means that the part that should be most concrete is instead confusingly abstract. Often this approach leads to feeling that you have plenty of time, and then suddenly you have no time at all. Conversely, we may avoid the project because it seems so large or complicated that we cannot figure out how to get started. We know how much we need to do and by when it should be done, but we don't know how it actually happens. And then we often feel guilty about leaving our writing until it's almost due, and we may blame ourselves for laziness or poor planning. While those can be factors, it's better to be compassionate and fair with ourselves. In reality, we're all very busy, and daily or weekly writing calls to us much more softly than our urgent responsibilities. You may be teaching, you may have work commitments, you may have to do like a weekly meeting and you have to be prepared for that. And these things all are important, but they eat into our writing time. And because the writing time tends to be unstructured, then we don't really have a good way of making sure that we're accountable to ourselves for it. And also because it requires a lot of inspiration and creativity, then when we're not feeling well because we're so overwhelmed with our other goals, then it's kind of a hard sell to say, yeah, okay, now stop for an hour and write. The problem with this is that we end up putting our writing off until it becomes a source of anxiety. And then our troubled feelings about the project may make it harder to sit down and write than it was before. Now, you often hear the solution is that you schedule a regular time to write. And this can include a writing group for solidarity, which is what we're doing now, or it could be solitary quiet time so that you can concentrate well. The basic idea is that you set a goal for the session. Usually it's a certain number of words or pages, and then you write without too much planning or revising. You just sit down and write. In theory, if you do this, you can make slow and steady progress on your project without too much stress. However, this is still a vague plan, and it leaves us vulnerable to the anxiety of sitting down to a blank page with poorly defined short-term goals that provide little guidance in the moment. The first step to dealing with this is to have a coherent idea about how to set goals and why. Then we can start each writing session by taking a few minutes to set a realistic goal that takes into account what needs to be done, how feasible it is in the available time, and whether we feel capable of that particular task in that moment. Although your finished writing for publication should be linear, presenting information in a logical structure that builds over the course of an article, paper, or chapter, your writing process probably isn't linear at all. The best academic writers are flexible, allowing their plans to change as they encounter new sources, engage in conversations with colleagues, and develop new ideas. It's important to keep an eye on inflexible deadlines, but within those constraints, the most useful goals are often small, achievable, and thematic. One way to think about your writing goals is by using the SMART framework, and this comes out of management theory. And so the SMART framework stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-limited goals. We're going to go over each one of these. So for specific, I suggest thinking of this in a thematic way, not based on word count or page numbers. Now, it's good to keep those in mind so that you have a general idea of what you want to achieve with your final writing, with at least your draft. However, it's not really that helpful to only think about it in terms of, okay, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to write 500 words. Okay, but like, what are those 500 words? It's not that specific. And it's also arbitrary. Instead, what you can do is you can divide a text of any size into small chunks that are reasonable for a writing session of 30 to 60 minutes. These chunks may be as short as a paragraph or as long as a couple of pages, but they should cover a limited and cohesive theme. If it's difficult to break down a complex portion of the text into smaller pieces, then ask yourself, what does the reader need to know to understand this idea? It's likely that you will realize that you need to explain a procedure, describe a source, justify an approach, or give some background on how this idea was developed or used in the past. Each of these can be the basis for a separate, specific task. For example, if you know that you need to explain the definition of a complicated term or concept, writing a draft of just this chunk of text is a good specific task. Measurable. Using the previous example, when you finish writing a draft of your definition, you know that the task is done. This makes it measurable in a more concrete sense than with a word count or page count, and you have the satisfaction of completing a task instead of reaching an arbitrary benchmark. If you make an outline that allows you to visualize your project as a series of these small, specific tasks, you can use it as a checklist to keep track of your progress and what still needs to be done. However, make sure that you revisit your outline periodically to account for changes and new ideas. You want to make sure that even though you're looking, in this case, at your goals in terms of what you can get done in a writing session, you want to make sure that these fit into the framework of your larger goals and that you're not running off on tangents. So you might want to take a moment at the end of each writing session and just kind of organize what you've done, maybe keep a log and compare it to what your more long-term goals are. Achievable. A small chunk of text, 1 to 4 paragraphs, on a limited, specific topic is an attainable goal, especially when it is anchored to specific source materials, and even more so when you frame it as a first draft, not as a polished text. Knowing that you will go back and revise your work later gives you the freedom to make mistakes. Perfection is the enemy of the good, and excessively high expectations for a first draft can dramatically limit your productivity in a writing session. Relevant. It's important to read widely and be open to ideas, but that is not the same as what you're doing during your productive writing time. That's when you should focus on tasks that are directly relevant to completing your project. This other work can really take over your planned writing sessions. So you want to be really careful that you don't, sit down to write and then find yourself reading an article, or find yourself, scanning online for different articles or bibliography mining or whatever. Try to sit down with something that you can actually work on to get ideas out onto the screen, onto paper, wherever you're recording them, so that you're not just constantly taking in information and not producing anything. Time limited. Long-term and weekly goals are important for keeping on track and remembering larger goals, but your writing session goals should be tailored for the amount of time you have in that session. You should end the session with an actual accomplishment that serves as a real step on the path to finishing your writing project. So now we have this idea of how to set goals, but realistically, a lot of us run into problems when we actually sit down to write. Setting goals is only one part of the equation. The other part is all about how you feel as a whole human being when you sit down to write. You don't magically become less busy and less stressed during your scheduled writing time. You may be tired from meetings, you may be worried about your next class, or distracted by thinking about all the chores waiting for you at home. Fighting these feelings usually does not work. But if you only write when you are feeling totally calm and creative, you will only occasionally make progress. If you only present yourself with a blank page and a vague goal of how much to produce for each session, but no sense of what or how, you will often find yourself frustrated and far less productive than you hoped. However, there are ways to make your scheduled writing time productive even if you are not feeling your best. You can think of your writing time as falling into two categories: A time and B time. A time is when you're at your best as a writer. It's up to you to determine what this means: writing alone or in a group, in the morning or at night, or in long or short blocks of time. You can try to plan for A time by scheduling your writing for ideal times and setting up your workspace under ideal conditions. However, depending on how you feel that day or what else might be happening before or after your writing time, you may find yourself in B time instead. B time is when you write under less than ideal conditions. You may try to get 20 minutes of writing done before a class, even though you know that you will feel interrupted when you have to stop. Or you may write for half an hour in the evening, even though you know that you are better at it in the mornings. And sometimes this is all we can manage with our busy schedules. Now, the trick to using these times well is to be honest with yourself about how you are feeling and set realistic goals at the beginning of each session. If you try to force yourself to write parts of your text that require more creativity or intellectually taxing analysis when you are not feeling well, you won't be happy with the results. Instead, try one of these goals. Make diagrams or tables based on information that you've already gathered. Create a mind map using concepts and sources that are already familiar. Organize your sources, or add captions or footnotes to a draft. Notice that all of these stay very close to things that you've already written or to source materials, readings or data that you've already generated or gathered. Keeping very close to the materials can give you limited achievable goals. When you're not at your best as a writer, it may be hard to write at all, and the writing you produce may not be useful. It's fine to do this sometimes. Now, free writing, which is just writing without a goal, can be a great way to work out ideas. And you may even want to dedicate a portion of each session to timed free writing to encourage creative, nonlinear thinking. It's a great way to know what you're thinking if you just sit down and write. However, if you're using your productive writing sessions to do a lot of free writing and you're not doing any real targeted writing, goal-oriented writing, perhaps by accident, you will come up with the text that you need. But it's also very likely that you end up chewing up a lot of time doing things that aren't directly relevant to your project. And then you end up not really reaching your goals. Any mechanical task that does not directly contribute to a draft can become a form of procrastination. So these tasks that we looked at before, these are great, but you can also dive into mind maps or organizing your sources and just keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it. You'll be really organized and you'll have no draft. So you have to think about, how you're balancing the different activities. And you need to be honest with yourself about your work patterns and frequently assess how helpful and necessary these activities are in the scope of the larger project, even if they are productive in a more general sense. And this is why it can be very helpful to keep a log of your writing activities. Now, what if most of your time is B time? You can find yourself in a very busy period when nearly all of your writing time is B time. And there's a strategy for this. Now, you can see again, these B time activities, some of them produce actual text towards your drafts, some of them do not. And so you can start redirecting your B time writing so that you produce low stakes chunks of text that you can pull into your draft later. Don't just take notes on an article, instead write a few sentences critically summarizing it and putting it into context as you would for a literature review. And then you can just pull that text over later. Write down a few thoughts or ideas inspired by a source and see if you can develop one in a couple of sentences. Again, you could just pull it over into the draft later. And you haven't made yourself feel too stressed out about being really creative because you've stayed really close to your source materials. So, putting it into practice. My advice for realistic goal setting for a single session is to start by identifying whether you are in A time or B time. Then use the SMART framework to set a goal that is appropriate for your project and how you feel at the moment. If you are in A time, set a writing task that is limited not by the page count or the word count, but by the task itself. although it may be useful, again, to give yourself an estimated page or word range just so that you have a sense of the scope of the task. You should be able to finish the task in one writing session and walk away with a justified sense of accomplishment. If you finish, you can always make a second task. Sitting down to write a chapter is a recipe for writer's block. Instead, good A-time tasks might be create a very short 2 to 3 paragraphs critical summary of how several major authors approached a specific concept or term. Explain how you define a term and why. Explain one major consideration in your methodology and how you chose to handle it, and usually in 1 to 3 paragraphs. Now, if you feel like it's a B-time session, then base your writing task on a specific source, some part of your data, or a specific research procedure. And this way, the existing materials will provide guidance and a foundation, and nothing you write in B-time will come completely from your own mind when you're not feeling your best. Good B-time tasks that will result in usable text for your draft might include briefly summarizing a source, but including a sentence or two of critique or commentary, writing 2 to 3 ideas or questions based on a source, compare 2 sources, make a new note about a concept or idea and add some citations or quotations that pertain to it. Write a short explanation of some piece of data or a detail about your methodology that you know you will need to describe in your draft. Now, be prepared that your A-time session may shift into B-time toward the end of that session. You're going to get tired, most likely. You might lose motivation. In that case, you can do things like get yourself organized for the next session, which is a really good idea because you don't want to chew up the time at the beginning of the session when you're feeling your best, when you're nice and fresh and you're sitting down feeling motivated to spend a whole bunch of time organizing yourself for that session. It should be more like 5 minutes spent getting situated, thinking about your goal, and then just get going. So the more that you can shift this sort of organizational work into the end of the session when you're tired, the better. You can also do that later on. If you feel motivated through the whole session, then maybe take like 10 minutes at some other point in your day or in another day and just kind of think about how you organize for your next session. You can also make a short list of sources to check, or you could revise something that you wrote in a previous session. It's best to not do a lot of revision in your writing sessions because it's kind of a different task and it takes a different mindset. But, if you're not feeling that great and you have, 5 minutes at the end, why not go back through a paragraph? You may want to use the end of your session to fill out a daily log to keep track of what you did and which sources you covered. Now, what I was saying before about getting organized for your next session at the end of that one or at some other time, that's great, but the part about keeping a log is best done in that session or right afterwards so that you have it all fresh in your mind. Otherwise, you might forget what you've done. Not only will all of this work help you to stay organized, it's also going to give you some comfort when you're feeling anxious about your progress. So it can be good for your soul to do this kind of work. One final note, you do yourself no favors by repeating the popular mantra, you should be writing. And we hear this all the time, but writing what? Writing when? If your answers are my article or my dissertation and all the time, then you're just setting yourself up to live under a cloud of anxiety that will make you feel guilty for living your life. Because it is so vague, there's no way to satisfy this goal other than finishing the entire dissertation or the entire article, the entire chapter. And this means that you could live under your anxiety cloud for months or even years. Instead, if you can schedule your writing time and consider all the other time as specifically not scheduled writing, this is much more reasonable for you. Set specific but flexible goals that allow you to realistically assess your progress and make yourself accountable for how they are actually achieved, one writing session at a time. Thank you very much.